In a noisy kindergarten cafeteria, two little girls sit at the very edge. Their lunch nothing but a piece of dry bread and a bottle of water. Laughter and whispers rise around them, each word cutting deeper than the hunger they hide. And at the doorway stands a German shepherd, blindfolded with white cloth, silent but unyielding, ears twitching at every cruel sound. No one knows yet that a man in a blue suit will walk in, stop in his tracks, and see what no one else dares to notice. This is not just a story about hunger and loneliness. It is a story about family, faith, and the quiet miracles God places in our path. The autumn sky over Willow Creek, Oregon carried a soft gray hue, clouds folding low against the forested hills like blankets of wool. A gentle drizzle had fallen earlier that morning, leaving the sidewalks damp and the smell of wet pine clung to the air. By noon, the weather had eased into a fragile calm, with pale light struggling to break through the clouds and filter down onto the cheerful red-brick kindergarten at the heart of town. Inside, the cafeteria was alive with clattering trays, bursts of laughter, and the metallic sound of spoons striking bowls. The walls were painted in pastel murals of animals and trees, meant to soften the day for children, but the noise was still overwhelming, a small storm of youthful chaos in one confined room. At one small table near the farthest corner, two 5-year-old girls sat side by side, their posture almost mirroring one another's. They were twins, though not identical in spirit. Anna Harper, the quieter of the two, had pale skin and hair the color of ripened wheat, pulled neatly into two braids tied with fraying ribbons. Her blue eyes seemed larger than most, not from joy, but from the way she often widened them when nervous. Anna's shoulders curled slightly inward as if she were trying to shrink into her yellow cotton dress, which had faded from too many washes. Her cardigan, a hand-me-down in pale gray, hung loosely from her arms. Anna had a gentle soul, soft-spoken even for her age. She rarely raised her voice, not because she lacked words, but because she had already learned that silence was often safer. Beside her sat Grace Harper, her twin sister, a child with the same golden hair, though cut into a shorter bob that brushed her cheeks. Grace's eyes, also blue, burned brighter, holding a spark of defiance even when her chin quivered. Her cardigan was a shade darker than Anna's, her dress patched in places, and her shoes scuffed from days of running in the yard. Grace was the kind who would face down even the tallest boy in the playground if he dared mock her sister. Though she was only 5, there was a quickness in her gaze that hinted at a lively imagination, the kind that could conjure stories out of shadows. On the table before them sat a small plastic container holding a single piece of plain bread, and between them, one half-empty bottle of water. Anna tore the bread into tiny pieces, nibbling quietly, while Grace sat straighter, glancing toward the other children across the room. The noise of the cafeteria wasn't kind today. A group of children at a crowded table had begun whispering and snickering, their giggles cutting sharper than the clamor of trays. "Poor kid's lunch," one boy's voice rose just loud enough to carry. His words drew laughter from the cluster around him. Another girl pointed toward the bread, her grin cruelly exaggerated. Anna's cheeks flushed red, her small hands tightening around the crust of bread until it nearly crumbled. She lowered her gaze, pretending to study the scratches on the table. Grace, on the other hand, straightened her spine and shifted closer to her sister, wrapping an arm around Anna's shoulder as if to shield her from invisible blows. Her face set in a scowl, though her young age meant her anger came out more like a pout, lips pressed tightly together, chin lifted with stubborn pride. No teacher interrupted. The cafeteria supervisor, busy near the serving line, gave a passing glance but did not catch the cruelty. For Anna and Grace, this was not new. While the children laughed, the front doors of the cafeteria opened and David Miller stepped inside. David was a man of 45, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to draw quiet even from adults. His dark brown hair, neatly combed, was streaked with strands of early silver, the kind that suggested both authority and long years of pressure. His suit, deep navy blue with a crisp white shirt beneath, fit him with tailored precision, and a silver watch glimmered faintly at his wrist. To the teachers, he looked every inch the successful executive, a man used to commanding boardrooms and signing deals that shifted fortunes. But beneath his composed exterior lay a quieter history. As a child, David had grown up in a household where meals were uncertain and hand-me-down clothes were all he knew. He carried those memories silently. The shame of opening a lunchbox that looked nothing like the others, the sting of laughter from children who never knew hunger. Over the years, he had buried those recollections beneath success, but he never truly forgot. David was in Willow Creek that day for a foundation inspection, a routine obligation. His company's charitable wing had funded new playground equipment and a library corner for the kindergarten. The principal, a kind woman in her 60s with soft gray curls and glasses perched low on her nose, guided him through the hallways with practiced warmth. She spoke of improvements, of children thriving, of the bright colors that now filled their learning spaces. Yet, when they reached the cafeteria, David's focus wavered. The laughter and chatter of the children spilled toward him, a cacophony of energy. He might have walked past it all, nodded politely, and moved on. But his gaze caught on the two little girls in the far corner, their yellow dresses faded, their heads bent over bread and water. Something inside him stalled. He noticed the subtle difference between them. One girl shrinking inward, the other trying to be a shield. He saw the bread divided too carefully, the way they pretended not to hear the whispers echoing across the tables. His chest tightened with an old, unwelcome recognition. It was as if he were looking back through time at himself, alone, mocked, quietly wishing for food that looked like everyone else's. The principal's voice faded in his ear as she gestured toward the colorful murals on the walls. David nodded, absently, but did not answer. His eyes never left the twins. His footsteps slowed, heavy, deliberate, until he stood still in the middle of the bustling cafeteria. The sound of laughter rose again from the crowded table. Anna hunched lower, Grace glared defiantly. And in that instant, David knew the visit he had intended to treat as a mere obligation had already changed. He could not simply walk past. David Miller's polished shoes echoed against the cafeteria floor as he moved past the teachers, who exchanged confused glances but said nothing. The tall man in the tailored navy suit, silver watch gleaming faintly under the cafeteria's fluorescent lights, did not walk toward the rows of honored guests near the front. Instead, he carried a plastic tray from the serving line, loaded with pasta, a carton of milk, and fruit, and strode with deliberate steps to the far corner where two small girls sat, isolated from the rest. His broad frame seemed out of place among the sea of small children, yet his expression softened as he reached the table. Anna Harper's eyes widened, her braids slipping forward as she turned timidly toward him. She looked at her sister Grace as though searching for permission. Grace, bold despite the flush of embarrassment still staining her cheeks, narrowed her blue eyes with suspicion at this stranger in a suit. She held her crust of bread tightly, chin lifted in defiance. David crouched, lowering his tall figure so his eyes aligned with theirs. His voice, usually commanding in boardrooms, softened into something warmer. "Hi," he said gently, his lips curving into a smile that carried no trace of pity. "Would you mind if I sit here?" For a heartbeat, neither child spoke. Then Grace, ever the protector, jutted her chin out. "It's our table." Her voice was small, but her tone was braver than she felt. David nodded solemnly, his expression playful. "Well then, I suppose I'll need permission from the table owners." He slid onto the bench beside them, placing his tray down as if he had always belonged there. The cafeteria's clamor dimmed in that pocket of space. Some children stopped whispering, their smirks faltering. The sight of a powerful-looking man in a suit sitting with the poorest children at school was strange enough to silence even the boldest. David glanced at Anna, whose fingers still tore nervously at her bread. "You know," he began, "once when I was about your age, I rushed out the door and grabbed the wrong thing for lunch. When I opened it at school, I realized I'd packed a can of dog food." Anna blinked, startled, before a faint giggle escaped her lips. Grace's eyes widened, incredulous. David exaggerated his grimace, describing how he sat staring at the can, too embarrassed to admit his mistake. "I thought if I opened it, the whole cafeteria would smell it and never let me live it down." The girls leaned closer, despite themselves. The weight in Anna's shoulders lightened, her eyes sparking with shy amusement. Grace tried to keep her scowl, but soon snorted out a laugh, quickly covering her mouth. David chuckled with them, easing the sting of the earlier taunts. But as this small circle of laughter formed, another figure had already been watching from near the cafeteria entrance. Scout, the German shepherd, sat with quiet dignity just inside the doorway. At 7 years old, the dog's sable and tan coat still held its thick sheen, though his once sharp eyes were clouded with blindness. A strip of white cloth was tied carefully around his head, covering the sockets and sparing others the sight of his ruined vision. Despite his blindness, Scout's ears flicked attentively, catching the rise and fall of voices, the scrape of chairs, the unkind whispers that floated his way. A few children near the door had begun whispering about him too. "Why does that dog wear a blindfold?" one boy sneered, loud enough for others to hear. "It can't even see. What good is it?" Laughter followed, though thinner now that David's presence commanded the room. Scout did not move. He sat as still as a stone, only the rhythmic twitch of his ears betraying his alertness. His nose lifted faintly, catching the familiar scent of the twins across the cafeteria. His loyalty to them was absolute, even if his eyes could no longer protect them. Once, years earlier, Scout had been a rescue dog, trained to aid officers in dangerous terrain. A tragic accident during a collapsed building search had robbed him of his sight, yet not of his dignity. Now, under Susan Harper's care, he had become both guardian and comfort to her daughters. Though the children around him mocked, Scout's stillness carried a quiet strength, as though he needed no words to declare his worth. From across the cafeteria, David noticed the dog. His brow furrowed for a moment, but then his gaze shifted back to the girls. Grace followed his glance and straightened proudly. "That's Scout," she announced, her voice sharp, daring anyone to challenge her. "He's our dog." "Your dog?" David asked, his smile returning as he turned his eyes toward Scout. "He looks very wise." Anna spoke then softly, her words barely above a whisper. "He can't see anymore, but he still knows things." David felt the air tighten in his chest. There was something profoundly symbolic in the blindfolded dog, and the quiet children mocked for their bread and water lunch. Both carried their own burdens, but both carried themselves with quiet dignity. Around them, the cafeteria had shifted. The children at the table that had jeered earlier now stared uneasily, their amusement drained. Teachers exchanged approving looks, but said nothing. Somehow, without a raised voice or a reprimand, the laughter had been silenced. David picked up his fork, twirling pasta as though this were the most natural meal of his life. "You know," he said casually, "sometimes people laugh at things they don't understand. But it doesn't mean those things aren't strong. Sometimes the strongest ones are the quietest." Grace tilted her head, curiosity breaking through her defiance. Anna's small hand, still clutching her bread, rested quietly on the table. The moment held, fragile but real. A man, 2 small girls, and a blind dog at the corner of a noisy cafeteria, yet somehow commanding more presence than the rest of the room combined. For David Miller, this was the moment his purpose shifted. He had not come here to find children sitting alone with bread and water. He had not come to see a blind dog endure ridicule with patience. Yet something in him knew he could not look away. And for the rest of the cafeteria, it was the moment the laughter stopped. The next morning in Willow Creek dawned colder than the day before. A sharp wind blew down from the hills, rattling the golden leaves that still clung stubbornly to the trees. The streets smelled faintly of rain-soaked pavement, and the people of the small Oregon town hurried along the sidewalks, bundled in coats. It was in this gray light that David Miller returned to his office in Portland, his mind restless. For most men in his position, CEO of a company that dealt in millions each quarter, yesterday's school visit should have been nothing more than a ticked box on a calendar. But the image of the 2 little girls with bread and water, and the blind dog standing watch at the cafeteria door, would not leave him. David had spent his life disciplining himself to push feelings aside. He was known for his calm authority, his ability to cut through noise and make decisions that left others hesitating. But now, in the quiet of his glass-walled office, he found himself staring out at the skyline, unable to shake the memory of Anna's lowered eyes and Grace's defiant little chin. He needed to know more. Through the school's director, a woman named Margaret Ellis, he arranged a conversation. Margaret was in her early 60s with a round figure, short gray curls, and eyes that carried both warmth and exhaustion. She had been in education for decades and was known around town as Miss Ellis, someone who fought tirelessly for her students. She wore conservative cardigans, always with a string of pearls that had once belonged to her mother. Though she smiled often, there was a heaviness in her that came from watching too many children fall through the cracks of a system too thinly stretched. Margaret welcomed David into her small office at the school later that week, serving him coffee in a chipped ceramic mug decorated with fading apple prints. He asked about the twins, careful to keep his tone casual. Margaret sighed, setting the mug on her desk. Their mother, Susan Harper, is doing her best. She works nights cleaning offices, then picks up shifts at the grocery store during the day. 2 jobs, sometimes 3 if someone offers temporary work. She's raising them alone. Margaret shook her head, her voice softening. She's a proud woman, quiet, doesn't ask for help unless she absolutely has to. But I know she's stretched to breaking. The name Susan Harper stuck with him. He imagined a woman younger than himself, burdened with exhaustion, yet fighting to hold her life together for her children. Margaret described how Susan always dressed plainly, faded jeans, a cardigan patched at the elbows, hair tied back in a hurried bun. She was slender, but wiry, the kind of person who carried grocery bags in both hands while guiding her daughters with a determined smile. She kept to herself, rarely socializing with other parents, though she was polite to everyone. Years of hardship had made her guarded. Her husband had left years. Ego, a man who had disappeared without a word when responsibility became too heavy. That abandonment carved into her a mistrust of promises, a wound David recognized all too well. David nodded quietly, his jaw tightening. He asked one more question. About the dog. Margaret's expression shifted. "Ah, Scout," she said, her voice touched with respect. "He used to belong to Officer Daniel Brooks." Daniel Brooks. The name stirred recognition in David's memory. He remembered seeing it in a newspaper years ago. Daniel had been a young police officer in Willow Creek, tall and broad, with a reputation for courage. He was killed during a rescue mission when a building collapsed after a gas explosion. His partner in that mission had been Scout, a German shepherd trained for search and rescue. The dog had been trapped alongside his handler for hours, and though other officers managed to pull Scout out alive, his eyes had been damaged beyond saving. After Daniel's funeral, the department decided Scout should retire. No one wanted to send a blind dog to a shelter, so he was entrusted to Susan, who had been a neighbor and friend to Daniel's widow. David pictured it, the brave dog who had once raced into burning rubble, now sitting patiently in a school cafeteria, blindfolded with a white cloth, protecting 2 little girls as though that was his new mission. It was both heartbreaking and noble. That evening, David sat in his penthouse apartment, overlooking the Willamette River. He poured himself a glass of water, not wine, because his mind was too full for indulgence. He thought about Susan, about Anna and Grace, about Scout. And for the first time in years, he felt a stirring of something unfamiliar. Responsibility for lives not his own. The next day, David began his quiet interventions. He made arrangements through the foundation to expand the school's lunch program discreetly, ensuring that no child, least of all Anna and Grace, would ever have to sit with only bread and water again. He donated art supplies for the entire class, remembering the way Anna had brightened when he mentioned colors. He sent playground equipment under the guise of routine charity work, so no one would single out the twins. At the same time, he spoke with a business partner who owned a small office downtown. Through a quiet chain of favors, a new clerical job was offered to Susan Harper. It paid better than cleaning at night, and it came with regular hours. Susan, wary at first, accepted when she was told it was part of a community initiative. She never suspected the hand of David Miller behind it. Meanwhile, Scout continued his silent vigil. In the weeks that followed, David found reasons to visit the school more often. He noticed how the dog never strayed far from the twins, how his ears flicked when strangers drew near, how his nose lifted as though scent alone could read intentions. Scout carried himself with the calm authority of a soldier, despite his blindness. Children no longer mocked him openly. They had grown too uncertain under David's steady gaze. Some, in fact, grew curious, asking softly if they could pet him. Grace, protective, allowed it only when she was sure their hands were gentle. Anna simply leaned against Scout's side, her tiny hand resting on his fur, trusting the warmth of his presence. As David watched, he realized something profound. Strength did not always roar. Sometimes it was a blind dog sitting with unyielding dignity. Sometimes it was a single mother carrying her world on tired shoulders. Sometimes it was a shy girl tearing her bread quietly, or her twin sister daring to stare down mockery. And as he left the school one late afternoon, the chill air biting against his face, David knew his quiet acts of help were only the beginning. He had stepped into their world, however carefully, and nothing in him wished to step out again. The evening air in Willow Creek was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys as families settled in for supper. The narrow apartment building where Susan Harper lived was modest but well kept, a 3-story structure with faded red bricks and iron balconies rusting in spots. The stairwell smelled faintly of laundry soap and old wood. David Miller found himself standing at the entrance with a folder tucked under his arm. The excuse was simple. He had come to deliver some paperwork for the clerical job Susan had recently taken, a position he had quietly arranged for her. But beneath the surface, there was more than business pulling him toward her door. Susan opened it after a hesitant pause, her figure framed by the warm glow of a single lamp inside. She was 28, her long chestnut brown hair tied back loosely, with strands falling across her tired but kind face. Slender and slightly stooped from long hours of work, she wore a faded cardigan over a plain blouse and jeans, her sleeves rolled halfway up her arms. Her eyes, a gentle hazel, revealed both weariness and quiet strength, the look of a woman who carried too much but refused to break. She greeted David politely, though a hint of suspicion lingered in her voice. "Mr. Miller, I didn't expect you here." "I was nearby," David replied with a small smile, holding out the folder. "I thought I'd save you the trip tomorrow." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in then. It's not much, but it's home." The apartment was small, just a living room that doubled as dining space, a narrow kitchen with peeling linoleum, and 2 bedrooms tucked off the hallway. It was neat, everything in its place, though the furniture was mismatched and worn. On the sofa sat Anna and Grace, both in their pajamas, yellow cotton sets with tiny faded flowers. Anna clutched a sketch pad while Grace leaned against Scout, who lay stretched on the rug, his blindfolded head resting calmly between his paws. His ears twitched at David's footsteps, nose lifting to catch his scent. Susan poured coffee into chipped mugs, apologizing for the lack of cream. David waved it off, sitting at the small dining table. They spoke of simple things at first, her new job, the girls' adjustment at school, the weather turning colder. Susan's voice was polite, but her guardedness remained. Years of abandonment had carved into her the instinct to question kindness. She thanked him for helping with the job, but made it clear she didn't want charity. It was then David noticed a frame on the shelf above the sofa. He rose quietly, drawn to it. The photograph inside was slightly faded, the corners curling with age. His breath caught. The image showed a woman in her 20s with familiar dark hair and a radiant smile. Standing beside her were 2 young girls, unmistakably Anna and Grace, only smaller. The woman in the picture was Laura, David's half-sister from his father's side. Laura had been a bright spirit in his otherwise troubled childhood, though they had grown distant as adults. She had passed away years ago, and he had carried the regret of not keeping closer. David turned, his voice quieter than before. "Where did you get this photo?" Susan's hand stilled on her mug, her eyes shifted warily. "That's my older sister, Laura. She was family to me. She died 5 years ago." The weight of realization struck David like a blow. "Laura was my sister too," he said, his tone heavy with certainty. "That means—" His eyes moved toward Anna and Grace. "Your daughters are my nieces." For a long moment, silence stretched. Susan's face stiffened, her jaw tight. If that's true, then why now? Why show up after all these years? There was steel in her voice, the mistrust of someone who had been failed before. David sank back into his chair, guilt surfacing. I didn't know. I didn't know she had children, or that she was gone. If I had—" His voice trailed, the ache in his chest real. Susan looked at him with conflicted eyes. She had built her world around caution, her heart scarred by those who had turned away when her sister needed them most. She saw in David a wealthy man who could offer much but might also leave when it became inconvenient. She could not bear her daughters being wounded by that kind of betrayal. "I don't want your pity," she said firmly. "We've managed on our own. We always have." David met her gaze steadily. "This isn't pity, this is family." Before Susan could answer, Grace had slipped off the sofa and walked over, clutching Scout's leash in her hand. "Uncle?" she asked, her head tilted, blue eyes curious. Anna followed more timidly, clutching her sketchpad against her chest. Susan's breath caught at the word. She wanted to protest, to shield them from false hope. But when she looked at her daughters, how naturally they gravitated to this man, how Scout's ears flicked as though sensing something true, her resistance wavered. David crouched, meeting the girls at eye level, his voice warm. "Yes, Uncle." He reached out carefully, not forcing the moment, letting them decide. Grace slipped her hand into his without hesitation. Anna hesitated, then allowed her small fingers to curl around his other hand. Susan's chest tightened as she watched. For years she had fought to give them stability, to protect them from disappointment. But in this moment, as she saw her daughters' faces brighten, she understood that David's presence was not wounding them. It was healing something they hadn't known was missing. Scout stirred, rising slowly to his feet. Blind though he was, he moved closer, pressing his shoulder against David as if to test him. David reached out, his hand brushing the dog's thick fur with reverence. "You've been their protector," he murmured softly. "Now, let me be one too." Susan swallowed, her defenses softening, though not falling completely. "We'll see," she said quietly, her tone less sharp now. "I won't let them be hurt again." David nodded, accepting the challenge without protest. He knew trust would take time. But as he sat there with Anna and Grace holding his hands, Scout leaning quietly against his side, he felt something undeniable. He had not stumbled into this moment by accident. Family had a way of finding itself, even after years of silence. A full year had passed since that quiet evening in Susan Harper's apartment, when truths had been revealed and hearts had begun the slow, tentative process of healing. Willow Creek had seen 4 seasons turn, from the brittle frost of winter to the blossom of spring, the warmth of summer afternoons, and finally back again to autumn's gold and crimson. With each change in weather, the lives of Anna and Grace Harper had shifted as well. The 2 girls, once isolated at the edge of the kindergarten cafeteria, now walked with heads held high, their laughter rippling like bells across the schoolyard. Anna, still gentle and reserved, had grown in quiet confidence. Her golden hair, longer now, was often tied in neat braids with colorful ribbons gifted by classmates who adored her. She still carried her sketchpad everywhere, but now she shared her drawings with others, showing them flowers and small animals captured in her delicate strokes. Grace, spirited as ever, had become the ringleader of their circle of friends, her bobbed hair bouncing as she darted across the playground. Her boldness, once a shield for Anna alone, had blossomed into leadership that drew other children to her side. Together, the twins had become inseparable from their peers, no longer lonely figures with bread and water, but vibrant girls filled with belonging, and always, at their side, there was Scout. The German shepherd, now 8 years old, had not regained his sight, but his presence had only deepened in strength. His sable and tan coat had dulled slightly with age, yet his posture remained proud, his ears twitching at the sound of the girls' voices, his nose lifted to catch their scent as they moved. The white blindfold across his eyes had become a familiar symbol to everyone at the school. To the children, he was no longer the dog to be mocked, but the guardian of the Harper twins, a noble figure who bore his blindness with dignity. Teachers called him the Silent Knight, and parents who had once raised brows at his presence now smiled warmly, seeing the way he walked shoulder to shoulder with Anna and Grace, steady as a sentinel. For David Miller, the transformation of the girls was nothing short of miraculous. In the years since he had stepped into their lives, he had made himself a constant, not as a benefactor in the shadows, but as family. He visited the small apartment often, not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. He took the girls to bookstores on weekends, where Anna carefully selected sketchbooks, and Grace chose brightly illustrated tales. He attended school events, sitting proudly in the second row of folding chairs, while the twins performed songs or showed off art projects. And through it all, he did not try to replace what had been lost in their lives. Instead, he offered something new, the certainty that he would stay. Susan, too, had changed. With the stability of her clerical job and the easing of endless night shifts, she had time, again, to breathe. She regained color in her cheeks, her hair shining healthier, her laughter heard more often in the evenings. She remained cautious in some ways. Her mistrust had been forged in fire, but her gratitude for David's steady presence softened her edges. She welcomed him into their lives, not as an intruder, but as family reclaimed. One crisp October morning, the school cafeteria filled again with the clatter of trays and children's chatter. The light from the high windows streamed down in golden shafts, dust motes floating lazily in the beams. The scene was not so different from the day a year ago, and yet it was entirely transformed. At the center table, Anna and Grace sat surrounded by friends, their voices bright as they chattered about a class trip to the orchard. Anna shared her apple slices, while Grace told a story so animated that even the teacher on duty chuckled under her breath. Their table was alive with warmth, the very opposite of the corner where they had once sat, small and unseen. Near the doorway, David leaned against the wall, his dark hair now flecked more with silver, his suit replaced by a casual jacket and neatly pressed shirt. At his side sat Scout, his posture steady, ears twitching at every sound. The two watched the girls without speaking, their silence filled with pride. David's chest swelled as he looked at them. He remembered the sting of seeing them mocked, the ache of realizing they were his family, the hesitation in Susan's voice when she demanded he prove his intentions. Now, all of that had transformed into this moment of simple joy. Anna's laughter rang out clear, Grace's grin widened as her friends leaned close, and David understood with certainty. This was what he had been searching for, though he had never known it. When the bell rang to end lunch, the twins jumped from their seats, their friends calling goodbyes. They hurried toward the door, Anna clutching her sketch pad, and Grace dragging her small backpack behind her. Without hesitation, their hands slipped into David's, one on each side, their steps falling in rhythm with his. Scout moved alongside them, his blindfolded head held high, the picture of silent loyalty. Together they walked out of the cafeteria, the same one where everything had begun, no longer fractured by loneliness or shame, but bound by family, love, and a quiet guardian whose white eyes had never stopped seeing the truth. David knew, as their fingers tightened around his, that he had not saved them. They had saved him too. And in that moment, beneath the pale autumn light, he finally felt whole. In the end, this story is not only about two little girls, a loyal blind dog, and a man who rediscovered his family. It is about the quiet miracles God places in our path. Sometimes those miracles do not arrive with thunder or lightning, but in the form of an outstretched hand, a loyal companion, or the courage of a child. Life often tests us with moments of loneliness, hardship, and doubt. Yet God reminds us that no one is ever truly forgotten. Just as Anna and Grace found strength in love and loyalty, we too can trust that He is guiding us, even when we cannot see the road ahead. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others who might need a reminder that hope is never lost. Leave a comment below, subscribe for more stories of faith and healing, and let us pray together that God continues to bless every one of you watching. Write amen in the comments if you believe that God still works miracles in the smallest corners of our lives.